All right. So, good evening, good morning, um, good very early morning, good afternoon to everybody who's here from different time zones. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am extremely honored that Professor Paul McGarr have I pronounced your name correctly?
Rabbit, perfect.
Okay.
Perfect pronunciation.
All right, that's great. Has agreed to join us today. I will formally introduce him, and then we would request him to speak to us about his latest book, and then we can do a Q&A with him. So let me introduce. Paul is an expert on U.S. and U.K. security and intelligence interventions within the Global South. His work focuses on intelligence liaison, non-Western intelligence cultures, disinformation, and covert action. His research has been funded by numerous funding agencies, very prestigious, grants that he's received. He is Joint Kings from the University of Nottingham, where he worked on a major project, Landscapes of Secrecy, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the contested record of US foreign policy from 1947 to 2001, which seemed like a great project which explored the role played by CIA in shaping official narratives of American foreign policy. He Today, and congratulations, Paul. Your book is out, Spying in South Asia, Britain, the United States, and India's Secret Cold War, from Cambridge University Press. It's hot off the shelf and the press, as they say. And we're really, really honored that you have taken time out to speak to us. At a considerably short notice. And thank you, Ali, for bridging that gap. And let me just briefly tell you about the MPhil Intelligence and Security Studies program that we have here at University of Lahore. Intelligence has been, somewhat of a sacred subject in Pakistan, and there has never been an academic inquiry into the subject. So we at the University of Lahore became the first university to receive an NOC from our Higher Education Commission to start this. And we are running a second semester, to mark the first year by the end of this semester, to start to start this subject in form of an academic discipline in Pakistan. So it's a pretty, new area for a lot of us. And we are relying really heavily on practitioners from the field, because obviously there are no academics within Pakistan. But because this field is so well established in the West, and also in Europe, that we want people like you to engage with our students and to broaden their horizons as to what type of research is happening around the world, so that they can engage and then start their research journeys in this discipline. So I'm extremely grateful for your time again. With this, over to you. You can take your time. We have a 2-hour slot here, and then we can have questions from the students. Thank you so much. Over to
Fantastic.
you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Rabia. And thank you much for that tremendously generous introduction. It's very kind, and I'm very grateful. And very grateful for everyone, as Rabia said. I know people are coming from very different time zones, so really grateful and thankful for everyone joining this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending where you are. So that's fantastic for you to do so. Very privileged to speak to you all today. I'm really excited as well. Rabia mentioned the program that's beginning at the University of Lahore in Intelligence Studies. Fascinating development, really excited by that. I know you guys are working with Julian Richards at the University of Buckingham, who I know very well, and we know very well at King's College London as well. And at King's, we work quite closely with Buckingham and other intelligence centres in the United Kingdom. I know this sort of discipline is, just as Rabia said, getting off the ground in Pakistan, and it's relatively new discipline in the United Kingdom. I think where I work, King's College London, probably the largest intelligence centre in Europe, certainly the largest one in the United Kingdom. So we've managed to grow from really humble origins over the last sort of 10 or 20 years to have about 9 or 10 academics now at King's College London who specialise in intelligence and security. And we sort of come together under the King's Centre for the Study of Intelligence, which is a relatively new development, bringing all those academics together. So we're really keen to work with, to partner, to support other institutions and universities across the globe, really, that are working on intelligence, and particularly so outside of what we would regard as the Anglosphere. So quite a lot of King's and I think intelligence history in the United Kingdom, generally over the last 10 or 20 years, has been quite Anglo-centric. So really focused on the United States, to a lesser extent, Western Europe, but not really engaging with intelligence, what we might call intelligence elsewhere, I guess, intelligence in Latin America and Asia and Africa. And we're very keen to work with partners, both intellectually, but also in terms of supporting research, if we possibly can, around that sort of endeavour, really, to spread intelligence knowledge and to treat intelligence really as the global issue, the global phenomenon that it really is, for the first time. So really excited to speak to you all because of that. I'm really excited to help in any way that we can to support the programme that you're getting off the ground, and sounds, as I said, incredibly exciting. I'd probably mention one thing from King's. I know you're working with Julian at the University of Buckingham, which is fantastic. I'm really excited and pleased that you're doing so. But yeah, if you ever need any support from King's College London, then we're perfectly happy to work with you guys. I know Rabia mentioned issues around academics, or very few academics or at all working in Pakistan on intelligence studies, and your reliance on practitioners, which I think is interesting. We went through a very similar process at King's College London when we began to get the process of developing an academic discipline in intelligence studies off the ground. So we've covered similar sort of ground, really. So we're very empathetic to some of the challenges that you're facing at the moment. What I would say that's quite interesting at King's, and because of our location, we're in the heart of central London, very near Whitehall, very near the headquarters of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, in the UK, and also MI5. And the Cabinet Office. So we have quite strong connections to policymakers and practitioners in the United Kingdom. And it was fascinating to hear Rabia talk about your links with practitioners perhaps in Pakistan. We have 2 research fellows at King's at the moment, actually, one of whom was a former head of the SIS station in Pakistan, in Islamabad, and another research fellow who was a former SIS head of their station in New Delhi, both around the time of the 1990s.
That's
so yeah, I
fascinating.
guess so it'd be fascinating to perhaps, maybe at a future point, get those 2 former SIS officers who have obviously direct experience of working, one in India, one in Pakistan, working, maybe talking to you guys and talking to some of your students about their experiences as a British intelligence officer.
Would love
Working.
to do that, Professor, and we'll definitely, engage more with you bilaterally on it as to how to bring them on board. Great
Sure,
experience
yeah,
to
that'd be
share.
great. I mean, we're very keen to to get a dialogue going, really, just informally to talk to each other. And certainly our research fellows are, I think, very keen to speak to students. They're very as candid as they obviously as they can be. But yeah, certainly that would be a great opportunity. So thank you very much today. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, as Rabia very kindly mentioned, that I've just published a book on intelligence, really, in India, looking at British and American intelligence interventions with India from 1945 through to the end of the Cold War, about 1989, 1990. Now, I have to confess, I'll make a confession straight away, that the big elephant in the room around my book is, of course, Pakistan. So I've published an earlier book with Cambridge University Press a few years before this, and that dealt with the broader context of the Cold War in South Asia. So that was very much a history of Pakistan and India in terms of its relationship with the United States and Great Britain. So covered a lot of ground with Pakistan in that book, and it was probably a 50-50 division of content between Pakistan and India. When I was researching this book, for various reasons, I wanted to sort of it to be slightly more focused. The first book I published was an absolute doorstopper. It was enormous, trying to cover 20, 30, 40 years of the history of the subcontinent, taking in India and Pakistan and its relations with other international actors was a huge task, and it meant a very big book. So this book is the latest book I published on, which is called Spying in South Asia, which looks at India's intelligence relationship during the Cold War. It's big enough as it is. So that runs, I think, to about 350 pages or so. So to incorporate Pakistan into that narrative would have been very difficult, really. But I have a huge amount of information actually on Pakistan and Pakistan intelligence and intelligence liaison, particularly with the United States and Great Britain. So absolutely, it's one of my future projects is to work more directly on intelligence links between Britain, the United States and Pakistan during the Cold War period and beyond. I'm particularly interested, I don't know if any of your students have come across this phenomenon of a particular British intelligence agency, which is called the Information Research Department, which was part of the British Foreign Office, but was very closely linked to the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. It conducted quite extensive operations, Cold War operations in India, which I go into in my latest book, really around covert propaganda. So grey propaganda, but also black propaganda, engaging in forgeries, disinformation, to try and change the political landscape of India during the Cold War. But the IRD also operated quite extensively in Pakistan as well. And I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty certain that no one has really published any papers or information about the work of the Information Research Department in Pakistan. It wasn't declared to the Pakistani government. So this was a British intelligence operation that was very much covert and clandestine, but was quite extensive in Pakistan, certainly during the Cold War period. So I've got quite a lot of information on that. So it'll be really interesting at some point to turn that into either a journal article or a book and talk about British intelligence intervention.
Absolutely. I just want to ask you, Paul, have you visited Pakistan?
Yes, once. So I've been to Lahore, actually.
Okay, that's
Just once.
great.
And a beautiful city, and I absolutely loved Lahore and would like to come back again.
Absolutely.
Fantastic country. Yeah, I had a wonderful time in Pakistan. Actually, one of my research students who has just finished an MA at King's. We do an MA in intelligence studies, and is going on to hopefully study for a PhD, is from Lahore and is working on Pakistani intelligence and their relationship with the United Kingdom. So hopefully we will have a PhD student at King's who's a native of Pakistan. She's been working for the Pakistani High Commission in the UK for a couple of years. And hopefully she will be starting her PhD studies in the next 6 months or so. So that'll be a fantastic opportunity for us to learn more about Pakistan and Pakistani intelligence. But yeah, we'd love to work with you guys, for example, and get your feedback on that particular project would be fascinating.
Absolutely. What year did you visit Lahore, may I ask?
It was in 1993.
Oh,
Quite a
wow.
long time ago.
You are now going to recognize Lahore now. You know,
I'm sure it's changed.
Change is an understatement, like, but we'd love to host you at University of Lahore once I'm back. So perhaps we can work together for next fall and plan a visit and, have a series of workshops or lectures, for you. Would love to host you at University of Lahore. That's an offer, from my end for you.
Well, thank you, Rabia. That's very generous, and I'd love to take you up on that. It would be fantastic. And likewise, we are very keen to have visiting scholars at King's College London. We have an extensive visiting scholar program in our intelligence studies area. So absolutely, to you guys, open invitation to come and give us seminars, give us papers, work with us. We're very open to doing so, and should be able to accommodate people from the University of Lahore to come over and establish that connection. So for example, if you are in the UK, maybe reaching out to Julian at the University of Buckingham, and that's a more formal connection. If any of you are in the UK at any time doing that, or if you're just visiting the United Kingdom, please do get in touch, because we'd love to host you to give a paper or a seminar or a series of talks at King's. That would be absolutely fantastic. So yeah, likewise, open invitation for that to happen.
That would be wonderful. And as this, generation, the first inaugural pioneers, in Pakistan are trained in this discipline, we would love to, have them visit King's and learn from all the scholars that are there. So like I said, it's a very new field, so we need all hands on deck for that. And thank you so much for that offer.
Yeah. completely empathetic, because I think we've been for a very similar process, not too far away. So yeah, we're very sympathetic and we're very supportive. So yeah, we'd absolutely love to work with everyone at the University of Lahore and provide any sort of support in any capacity we possibly could. So yeah, take that as a given, really. What I was going to do is talk briefly about my book. As I said, it's a bit of a doorstopper. It's quite a big book. Covering everything in there is probably too much to get through in any single session. But what I'd hoped to do today was just talk or identify some sort of central themes which I think come out of the book, which are applicable to Britain and the United States' intelligence relationship with India. And I can touch at various points on how that sort of overlaps into intelligence operations in Pakistan as well. But really just to talk about some central themes in that book, if I may. I have actually got some slides, which I will, I'm not particularly technically proficient, but I will try.
Let me make you a
Can you, yeah,
Yes.
if it's possible to do that, then
Yes,
might be able to put some slides up.
absolutely. You should be able to share the screen now.
Okay, let's have a go. Yes, I can. Right. So I'll put them up just because these can act as a prompt, and it's always good to have some sort of visual cues as we go through. So this is the front cover of my book. I wasn't, to be honest, when I first saw the front cover, I wasn't that keen on the orange color. So this is no indication of any political affiliation or for an individual, or if we're taking the United States, or anything in the subcontinent either. So please, this was Cambridge University's choice, and I wasn't entirely sure about the orange color, but I'm
Thank you
ensured
for
by
putting it
Cambridge
out there that this is not saffron.
Yes, absolutely. It is not saffron. I've been told by Cambridge that orange is the new black when it comes to book covers, and this is the reason why. But yeah, I did sort of ponder the wisdom of an orange cover. But so yeah, not my choice. But yeah, it's sort of warming to me. I'm warming to it just slowly. But yeah, so that's the front cover of the book. This is the King's Centre for the Study of Intelligence. This is our centre at King's, which we have about 10 or 11 academics, I think. Full-time academics working at the moment, quite a large and vibrant PhD research community as well. And we also run a large master's program in intelligence studies as well. I think we have this year 140 students on our intelligence master's program, so it's a considerable size. So we're intelligence is booming in the United Kingdom as an academic discipline, and we're central to that, really. And King's is an exciting place to work when it comes to intelligence. So a few slides just to sort of kick us off and get into the swing of things. So as I said, the book is quite sweeping chronologically. It runs from about 1945 through to the early 1990s. So it covers a lot of chronological ground, covers quite a lot of thematic ground as well within the book, and engages with really the evolution of Britain and the United States' intelligence relationship with India, which I think was unsurprisingly quite bumpy. At certain points, India cooperated quite closely with Britain's SIS, MI5, the British Security Service, and also the Central Intelligence Agency. But at other points, that relationship was incredibly fractious. And certainly towards the end of the Cold War period, it became highly politicized. And by that, I mean that intelligence really became an issue that sort of bled over into Indian diplomacy. And we saw Indian politicians, Indira Gandhi particularly, using intelligence as a means of deflecting from her mismanagement of the economy, political problems in India, domestic upheaval and tensions within the Indian sort of body politic really during that period. So the Central Intelligence Agency, particularly really from the sort of mid 1970s, becomes almost like a political football in India, and Indian politicians use the CIA as a convenient scapegoat. The notion of a foreign hand, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is really becomes quite sort of ubiquitous in India from the mid 1970s onwards. And interestingly, that does have, I think, I'll go into this slightly in detail a bit more later, but has two really serious consequences, I think. I think the Indian government and Indira Gandhi's sort of personal sort of emphasis on the Central Intelligence Agency as a convenient scapegoat for India's broader ills and the evocation of a foreign hand. I think it does two things. One, it absolutely weakens India's relationship with the United States. So there's quite strong evidence that Washington loses patience with Indian governments from the 1970s onwards, really, because of their willingness to use the CIA as a political football. So there's a huge diplomatic tension between Washington and India, and I'll mention this a bit later. That does have practical consequences for the relationship between the United States and India. And the second broader issue, which I think is probably more important, and I'd be really interested, perhaps in the Q&A, to get your perspective, everyone's perspective on the call today, on whether and how this sort of impacted Pakistan, or what the Pakistani perspective is on this. But I think that focus on the Central Intelligence Agency and the sort of politicization of intelligence as a sort of a diplomatic tool in India really has quite, I think, socio-political consequences. It sort of fuels this political climate of conspiracism. It erodes public trust, I think, in some of the bureaucracy in India, and it leads to this sort of almost paranoid culture around foreign intelligence and how it might be subverting or manipulating the Indian state. So I think that's quite an interesting sort of social phenomenon, which is still very much present in contemporary India, I think. But the roots of that begin, I would say, around the sort of mid to early 1970s. So sort of a couple of interesting themes that perhaps we can pick up on later. This slide I put up because one of the key themes in the book, which I'll talk a little bit about, is agency. So one of the reasons I wrote the book, really, in the first place, was a frustration that all the intelligence literature that I was coming across really in the last 10 years or so was incredibly Anglo-centric. So there were lots of histories of the Central Intelligence Agency, lots of histories of the FBI and British MI6, etc. Very few histories of intelligence services in the global south. So I know I just mentioned we were just having a chat, Ravia, when you went to get your coffee, about a new intelligence series, The Concise History of Intelligence, which has been published by Georgetown University Press. And Julie Richards has just published The Concise History of ISI in that series. So that's a fantastic development. Another concise history has just appeared with Georgetown of Iran's intelligence and security services. I think this is a tremendous development, really important to study the intelligence services within the global south. And I think there's been a big lacuna really in intelligence studies. It's been far too Anglo-centric, far too sort of focused on the United States and Great Britain and European intelligence services. And I'd include Russia's FSB and SVR within that sort of European structure, but very little about intelligence services elsewhere, which I think has been a real mistake, which hopefully at King's we're trying to correct. And I know you guys will do a great job at contributing to that sort of that paradigm shift, really.
Paul, just to say something here, sorry to interrupt you. So we at University of Lahore are also pioneering a movement on decolonizing social sciences in Pakistan.
Okay.
And we've just started this project, and we want to have across social science disciplines, including intelligence security studies, to have conversations and develop indigenous thought processes about the subject and the discipline itself. So, so yes, this series is great at Georgetown, but what I want our students to do is like pick up all the, literature that is out there, and then, look at it from a decolonial lens.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a great contribution to literature, if we do decode and break it and bring fresher perspectives from our part of the world. There is very little that has been written on any of, the publications don't come out from our part of the world enough. So yes, in that stream, I would definitely, share more with you and would encourage our students to push against the narrative that even if it's based on evidences and historical evidences or archives, it still has a color to it, right? And I keep telling my students that Kissinger did not live in Pakistan, yet he had a view of Pakistan that you need to annihilate because you are the ones who live in Pakistan, right? And until and unless we push against the literature, no new knowledge or perspectives, are going to come. So I think this is just wanted to plug it in that we have set out on that path, and hopefully this movement will, pick up momentum of itself. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ever. I think that's very well put, and completely agree with that sentiment entirely. That the history of intelligence within the global south is incredibly problematic, and it has been written from a Western perspective. So, and the initiative you talked about sounds absolutely fantastic, and we'd love to support that and be a part of it. I think it's really, really important work, and it's long overdue, long overdue. So, yeah, absolutely sounds like a tremendous development that will really add a richness and a depth to intelligence studies, I think, which has been missing for so long. As part of the Georgetown series, actually, I was just saying that I'm actually going to write the concise history of the research and analysis wing. Now, so the pair volumes is what Julian's written about ISI, I guess. But I was really conscious of the fact that I didn't really want to write that work, that it really should be written by an Indian. It shouldn't really be written by me. So what we're actually going to do is I'm actually pairing up with Tanvi Patte, who works at Buckingham. So we're going to write it together. And I think just working together and writing partnerships, reaching out to people in Pakistan and India, research collaborations, joint projects, writing joint books, I think is really interesting, because then at least we can go some way to getting a Western perspective in that book, but also an Indian perspective or a Pakistani perspective in that book as well, which, as you say, is incredibly important. So yeah, we're really keen to do those sort of things. So hopefully that history of the research analysis wing, obviously it's going to be written a certain way, but hopefully it'll have a strong South Asian component in it, which I think will make it a much better and a much stronger book. So absolutely, we would embrace that, really. Which sort of gets me back to agency. Really, this quote from Jawaharlal Nehru, which I think is from 1954, so at the sort of beginning of the Cold War, really, but it speaks to this notion of agency. And it's one of the things I was really frustrated about, that in most of the intelligence literature I was reading, it was very much Western driven. There was very little indigenous voices, and very little consideration that governments outside of the Anglosphere had any sort of agency or power. And I found that as I was researching the book, that actually one of the great themes was the huge amount of agency and the huge amount of power that people in the subcontinent had when it came to intelligence. And although they're dealing with organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency, which today has a budget of $100 billion annually and is a huge monolithic sort of organization, history tells us that just because size and naked economic power and naked military power doesn't necessarily translate into agency, doesn't necessarily translate into your ability to manipulate events or a political landscape. And I very much found that when I was researching the book in India, that actually Indians at all levels, both elite levels from Nehru down, really, but also bottom up. And I'm talking about journalists and cultural producers and sort of local politicians, all were able to exercise significant agency, to the extent that often I found myself asking, who's manipulating who here? It struck me that actually South Asians and Indians particularly were very, very adept at using intelligence and manipulating intelligence agencies for their own benefit, really. So one of the themes was trying to recover Indian agency in this case, and just emphasize the extent to which this was a really powerful tool, I think, during the Cold War. So this quote from Nehru is thinking about broader diplomacy, but I think it applies in many ways to intelligence as well. That one of the reasons I think Britain and the United States take so many missteps when it comes to intelligence activity in the subcontinent is this failure to engage, this failure to be sensitive, either politically or culturally or socially, to powerful forces within India and Pakistan. So I was interested in that sort of development. Oh, by the way, this image, I probably should explain it very, very briefly, is of a fisherman from Kerala in southern India in 1958. And as you all know, 1957, the first sort of communist government, one of the first communist governments anyway, anywhere in the world, is democratically elected in the southern Indian state of Kerala. And this image appears in 1958, and it's a Soviet propaganda image on the back of the Communist Party of India winning power in the state of Kerala in 1957. So this is a year afterwards. And this image struck me as interesting because I don't know about you guys, but I have actually read some books by Khrushchev, and they are really, really painful. So I think if this guy actually did read Khrushchev, which I probably doubt, I feel sorry for him. So I think I've got a bit of sympathy for having to wade through dialectics by Nikita Khrushchev in the Cold War. But I thought it was an interesting propaganda image that the Soviets put out in Cold War India, just to emphasize the sort of this notion that communism is the wave of the future in India in 1958. So I will accelerate. Sorry, I know typical academic talking far too much and being far too verbose when you talk about a subject. So I'll try to accelerate so we have plenty of time for questions. But five themes that I picked out of this book that I think were really important. One was the tension between sovereignty and security. And I guess this applies to Pakistan as well. But in an Indian context, it was very much about the notion that having emerged from, a long period of colonialism, the last thing the Indian state wanted to do really was to move into a new imperial sort of security context where they were overly reliant on Britain or the United States for their security. And so there's a strong sense of wanting to practically demonstrate Indian sovereignty, both the Indian people, but also just as a political narrative, really, in the context of decolonization more generally, and India seeing itself as a sort of a primary sort of example of how a decolonization should work. So the tension, lots of tension between a sort of a very, particularly under Nehru and India following a policy of non-alignment, this notion of wanting to robustly promote the idea of a new Indian sovereignty, a post-colonial sovereignty from 1947 onwards, and that clashing with security concerns that India had. So obviously its fractious relationship with Pakistan and border disputes with Pakistan, but also border disputes with China, worries about indigenous communism, particularly in southern India, and how that was gaining traction, the wrenching effects of the partition of the subcontinent, sort of socially, economically, politically. So lots of areas where many commentators in the late 1940s, early 1950s are questioning whether India will even be able to remain a unitary state, given the pressures that seem to be pulling India apart. So sort of squaring that circle between wanting to manage or maintain a robust sense of sovereignty and people in the Indian government feeling that they may have to call on, particularly Britain and the United States, for support in intelligence and security is an interesting sort of dynamic, I think, that I explore in the book. The other thing that I mentioned in the book as well, which is a key thing, is challenging this East-West binary in intelligence. And we talked a bit about this, so I won't talk too much about it, but very much challenging that notion that intelligence is an East-West phenomenon. I found in the book that actually that isn't the case. A lot of literature is still East-West orientated, particularly following the Ukraine and Putin's emergence over the last decade or so. That East-West intelligence narrative is still as strong, perhaps, as it's ever been. But I wanted to complicate that and challenge it and say, look, this is also about North-South intelligence interaction. So liaison relationships between the United States, Great Britain, and other players in South Asia. But even more interesting, I think, and perhaps we can talk about this a little bit, South-South intelligence connections as well. So who are India and Pakistan talking about in their own neighborhood or even further afield? So I came across lots of evidence about Indian intelligence collaboration with Iran, with Chile, with Cuba, with Ghana. So lots of sort of intelligence collaborations that occur outside of the Anglosphere. And a lot of those, I think, were driven by, again, this need to put some distance between intelligence and security services in the global South and this sense that the CIA, the FBI, MI5, MI6, etc., were trying to dominate or control intelligence within the global South, and using that sort of intelligence liaison between countries such as India and Cuba, for example, is a way of breaking through or limiting that control by the West over intelligence practice within the global South. So that notion of changing the binary, I think, was interesting. The other thing I touched on was periodization of the intelligence Cold War as well. So again, moving away from chronological framing of the Cold War from a very much a Western perspective. So I think the West has very intelligence that should generally segmented the intelligence Cold War into certain blocks of time. And I don't think they work when we think about the global South. So I think, interestingly, I'll take one example. I'll go into this a little bit later, but the 1960s, for example, are often considered from an American perspective as a relative period of stability in the intelligence Cold War. Certainly after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, we get the United States wanting to pursue a policy of détente with the Soviet Union. Although we see nuclear, and Rabia can talk to this a lot better than I can, the nuclear arms race sort of accelerating post 62 as Khrushchev and his sort of successors try to redress the imbalance in nuclear power between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's been sort of starkly illustrated in Cuba in 1962. Generally, there is a period of détente, I think, during that decade. And it's where the intelligence Cold War is relatively stable between East and West. The Berlin Wall, for example, has gone up in 1961. Defections between East and Western Europe have slowed down. There's less tension in the intelligence relationship than ever. But actually, if you switch that around and look at it from a South Asian perspective, particularly, I'd say 1960s is the most intense, dynamic, problematic period in the intelligence Cold War in India and Pakistan in the 1960s. So the literature doesn't really represent that, I think, in the Western sort of canon, and it should do. So trying to change the periodization of the Cold War and approach it from a global South perspective was interesting. The main theme was this notion of collaboration and resistance. So I sort of mentioned this at the start. I think this notion that at certain points the Indian state works very, very closely with the intelligence and security services of Britain and the United States, particularly after really traumatic events in India's strategic history. So, for example, after the 1962 border war with China, when India gets a bloody nose and suffers a humiliating defeat, the intelligence agencies of Britain and the United States are really given an open door to come back into India and to work very closely with the Intelligence Bureau, but also subsequently the Research and Analysis Wing. But then we get to the 1970s, and particularly after the 1971 war, where that collaborative relationship breaks down, and we get Indian politicians and the Indian governments sort of resisting or pushing back on intelligence collaboration. So it's an uneven process. It's not a linear process, I think. And there's tension between collaboration and resistance in that intelligence relationship across the whole spectrum of the Cold War, I think. The final theme that I tried to deal with in the book, and I full disclosure here, I'm really a historian and not a social scientist, so Rabi will be a lot better at this than I am. But I struggle with the question of impact. So what does it all mean? Why is it significant? Why is it important? Why should we even think about intelligence in South Asia during the Cold War period and beyond? What did it make a difference? Is it significant? I think it is on a number of levels. I think I talked briefly about the social and political impact of intelligence in terms of fueling conspiracism and corroding and eroding trust in bureaucratic structures, which I think is really important and significant, but also just on a more sort of tactical level, whether intelligence actually mattered. Did it influence the outcome of elections? Did it impact any particular sort of important events in South Asia? So I must admit that I think this is the area of the book. So if anyone that actually does get around to reading the book, I'd really appreciate your thoughts on that, because it's one of the areas of the book I think probably needs to be developed more. I think it's a difficult area to engage with, but I was interested in the overall sense of whether this matters or not. So what I was going to do is very briefly go through each of those themes, maybe a couple of minutes on each, because I've talked to them about a lot of them already. So just a couple of examples. This, by the way, this image here, it's actually a letter that was sent by the first British MI6 Secret Intelligence Service officer posted to India after Indian independence in 1947. So this is an MI6 officer who is about to be posted to India in 1947. And he's writing to the Indian High Commission, the British High Commission in New Delhi in 1947. I think it was interesting because it says there's a couple of things about intelligence that I thought were worth noting. So this intelligence officer, if you want to know his name, buy the book because his name's in the book. So I'm going to keep that secret from you today. So this intelligence officer, interestingly, was a former member of the Indian Police Service who then worked under the British colonial regime, who then worked for the Intelligence Bureau in India prior to 1947. So it's someone who's sort of steeped in the history of Indian intelligence, colonial intelligence, and the colonial police service. And he gets posted back to India in 1947. Now, lots of people in Britain, in Whitehall, in the British Foreign Office, think that's a really bad idea because you're sending an intelligence officer back to India, post-colonial India in 1947, has been an integral part of the process of control and the colonial intelligence and security apparatus, which has been very repressive in India before 1947. So lots of people think this is not a great idea. But also it's interesting that this individual has a really lacks any sort of empathy or sensitivity or even sort of cultural sort of, cultural sort of nous really in dealing with what's going on. So he writes a letter to the High Commission in 1947. I remember we're in part the period of partition. Delhi is full of refugees. It's a capital in chaos. A very difficult situation that the Indian government is facing in 1947. And this SIS officer says, "Oh, I'm coming to Delhi, and could you source me a really large American car? I'd like a Chevrolet or a Ford, really expensive model if that's possible. Could you find me an air conditioning unit? Because I really need one if I'm coming to India. And also, could you put me up in the Cecil Hotel in Old Delhi, quite a grand hotel, which is completely removed from the British diplomatic community." So this sort of speaks to a complete lack of empathy and sensitivity to what's going on in New Delhi in 1947. But also, I mean, I can't think of anything more likely to identify yourself as an intelligence officer than driving around town in a big car. I mean, you should be sort of keeping in the shadows. And this guy is basically making every effort to make himself as conspicuous as he possibly can. So I thought interesting. And obviously he gets lots of pushback from British diplomats in India who say, "What on earth do you think you're doing? This is, a really, really bad idea." So interesting image I thought about the first SIS officer. I probably should say as well, actually, that SIS MI6 go back. They're sent back into India in 1947 by the British government. Lots of people in India, in Britain, think that's a really bad idea, and so it proves. I mean, within I think 2 years, all the SIS officers in India have been expelled by the Indian government. So they're kicked out of India because they are up to no good. They're trying to recruit Indian agents in the Indian government and armed forces. They're caught trying to bribe Indian officials, and so they're caught engaging in black propaganda operations. So Nehru essentially kicks them out in 1949, I think, and they're expelled. So they're actually only back in India for a very short period of time. They do return. So we mentioned this before, I think. So SIS isn't part of the Indian landscape per se from about 1949 until 1964. And the Secret Intelligence Service is allowed back into India in 1964 off the back of the 1962 war between India and China, and India's need for a greater intelligence sort of coverage and strength off the back of that sort of disastrous defeat, really. But so they don't last very long in India, really. And I think one of those reasons is this notion about decolonizing intelligence. So when we talk about sovereignty and security, I think, and again, I think this holds from the research I've done on Pakistan. I think this is a common theme between the two countries, that both states really are subject to tremendous security threats after 1947, but their intelligence services have been basically eviscerated by the British before the British leave South Asia in 1947. So most of the intelligence records have been destroyed by British colonial officials. There's a big bonfire in Delhi, similarly in Karachi and elsewhere. So the records are destroyed. So they have no institutional, organizational records to fall back on during that period. Just the simple division of the intelligence bureau between India and Pakistan is problematic. It means officers are divided between the two countries. The intelligence service as a whole is weakened. So that's an issue. So there are lots of issues around the fact that the British do not leave India or Pakistan with a functioning intelligence service after 1947 in any sense. So just when both countries are facing tremendous threats, they need really good intelligence. The British have basically left them without that capacity to develop it. So the process of decolonization is deeply problematic, I think, for both countries, really. There is this notion of an imperial hangover. So as I mentioned, MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, wants to go back in India, wants to get back to spying. One of the rationales for MI6 going back in is India. British aren't sure whether India is going to stay in the Commonwealth. So if India stays in the Commonwealth, then Britain might be able to get some security and intelligence information. But if India decides to leave the Commonwealth, which looks quite likely in 1947, then Britain will treat India as a foreign country. It probably won't have the same sort of access diplomatically or politically to India, and therefore it may need a secret intelligence service to acquire information from within India that it otherwise might not be able to get. But that doesn't last very long. And actually, it's the British Security Service, MI5, that becomes the sort of leading force in India. MI5 is interesting. India is quite happy for the British Security Service to operate in MI5 in India. It's not happy for the British Secret Intelligence Service to operate. So SIS is, synonymous with spying, espionage, covert action, subversion, and that sort of stuff. MI5 is really about security service. So how can we protect countries internally from really internal threats? So India is quite happy to work with MI5 because of the threats of communalism, indigenous communism, etc., regionalism in India that are threatening to pull the country apart. And actually, Nehru and Patel, Vallabhbhai Patel, in 1947 agree that MI5 can station a permanent officer in New Delhi from 1947 onwards. And the Intelligence Bureau, the Indian Intelligence Bureau, equally send an officer to London who's permanently stationed in London. So you have a permanent British intelligence presence in India from 1947 onwards. The key difference between SIS and MI5 is the MI5 office is over declared. The Indian government knows in New Delhi and they work closely with him. SIS isn't declared, it's covert, and that's one of the big problems really. But that MI5 officer actually stays in India from 1947 till 1968. And that's interesting. It's a really long period of time. And actually, when the MI5 officer leaves India in 1968, it's not because the Indians want him to leave. Actually, the Indians really plead with MI5 in 1968, please keep your security liaison officer in India. We need them. They're really valuable. We value their experience. We value their advice. We want them to stay in India. The British actually withdraw the officer from the MI5 officer from Delhi in 1968 purely for economic reasons. The British were in terrible economic straits in 1968 and Whitehall wants to save money. So they pull SLO MI5 officers back from all around the globe. So not just in India, but elsewhere around the globe. MI5 conducts basically a global retreat, really. And it's on the basis of economics. And it's interesting that MI5 actually saves the grand total of £8,000 per annum by withdrawing their security officer. And the Indians just can't understand this. They say this is an incredibly valuable relationship. We get a lot from it, but you get a lot from it too, because we are liaising on intelligence and security and we tell you things we wouldn't otherwise. Are you really saying that you value this relationship less than £8,000 per annum? And the British Treasury say, yes. So incredible. I think it's incredible, really, that happens, but interesting. The other thing I'd say about intelligence opportunism is how the intelligence relationship, and again, this is really, I think, very relevant to Pakistan and ISI and the sort of development of its liaison relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. India absolutely wants to replicate its intelligence relationship with Britain. It wants to replicate that with the United States. So Sanjeev Pillai is the first head of the Intelligence Bureau, first Indian head of the Intelligence Bureau in 1947. He doesn't want to work with the Central Intelligence Agency for exactly the same reasons he doesn't want to work with MI6, because the CIA are involved in espionage and spying and covert action, and not the sort of people you really want stationed in your country. He wants to work with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, because the FBI is concerned with domestic security, just like MI5 are. So that's the perfect partner for the for India with the United States. And Sanjeev goes to Washington in 1949 to negotiate with the FBI a partnership along the lines of that with MI5. And actually, Sanjeev is a massive fan of J. Edgar Hoover, interestingly. I can't imagine why, because Hoover's not particularly nice. I don't know if you know much about J. Edgar Hoover, but he's not a particularly nice individual and has lots of personal characteristics, which are pretty unsavory, really. But Sanjay has this image of Hoover as being this great domestic policeman. I mean, I guess maybe it's to do with police as well. The FBI are associated really with police work in the United States and domestic security. Sanjeev, typically for most intelligence bureau officers, has been a policeman in the Indian Police Service and has come up through the ranks of the Indian police. So he has an affinity with J. Edgar Hoover. So he goes to Washington in 1949 and says, want to have this relationship with the FBI. And he's absolutely snubbed by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover won't see him. He palms him off on junior officials. He gives him a tour of an FBI museum, which Sanjeev compares to like a high school tour, of a museum. It's completely, there's nothing. And he's really upset and affronted and slighted, and he feels humiliated by the way he's treated by the FBI, to the extent that he writes back to the American ambassador in India and says, if you even suggest any sort of relationship with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and J. Edgar Hoover, I will immediately veto it. I will immediately go to Nehru and say, this relationship is not happening. So he's been so upset by the FBI that he goes to extreme levels to basically sabotage any hope of the FBI having a relationship with India, which is absolutely not what he intended. But while he's in Washington and not getting on with Herbert Hoover and feeling very slighted by Herbert Hoover, who steps in but the Central Intelligence Agency, and they take him out for dinner and they wine him and dine him and they show him around Langley and they say, what a great guy you are. We're really interested in India. It's a really important country. Meet sort of senior officials he meets every senior official in the Central Intelligence Agency, all the way up to the Director of Central Intelligence, who sort of takes him to lunch in the private dining room at Langley. He could not have been wined and dined more by the Central Intelligence Agency. And we end up getting that relationship with the CIA forming with the Indian Intelligence Bureau. And I think that is really, really significant because that relationship is really based on just personal connections and a lack of personal empathy with J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA's sort of ability to court Sanjabi as an individual. But it has really long-term consequences, I think, for India's relationship with the United States in terms of intelligence. If that relationship had been established with the FBI, as it was with MI5 in the 1940s, I think the Indian intelligence relationship with the United States would have been very, very different in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So it's quite a fateful moment.
Two finger on it. Sorry to disturb you.
Sure, sorry.
Was it deliberate, good cop, bad cop, just to push India towards CIA if he got a brush off from the FBI? Is there any evidence for it?
Yeah, no, there's the only evidence we've got is from Sanjabi himself, and he seems he gives quite a long account of his interactions with J. Edgar Hoover, and I think his impression is that really Hoover is not a pleasant individual. He's an unreconstructed racist essentially, and he really, I think, has got no time for Sanjabi at all, or really anyone from India or Pakistan. So I think a lot of it is just to do with his racism, his personal prejudice. I don't think there's anything in the FBI files that suggests that they had struck a deal with the Central Intelligence Agency that would enable the CIA to step in and cultivate Sanjabi. At this point, the FBI and the CIA are still they are today, really, to be honest, but still have quite an antagonistic relationship. So I think Hoover would have been unlikely. I haven't got any evidence for this. This is supposition, but I think it would have been unlikely that Hoover would have deferred to the Central Intelligence Agency if he thought something was in it for the FBI. I think two things are at work, really. One, he thinks, well, I don't think India is important. So in the grand scheme of things, why would I bother to invest time and effort and resources in India? I just don't think it's important. And two, I think there is a sense of racism here as well from Hoover, and just he's if we look at files about J. Hoover and his conversations and audio tapes of his conversations, this is a deeply unpleasant individual, I think. So yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question, actually, Ravi. I don't know, but I haven't come across any evidence that suggests that this was sort of Washington's a plan by the White House or by the national security bureaucracy in Washington to engineer the CIA have a sort of relationship with within. I'd be surprised as well, because this comes at a point really in 1949 where Washington generally is not particularly interested in South Asia. So Harry Truman, for example, really India particularly is really low down on his list of priorities. He doesn't give any time to India. He's not particularly interested in the subcontinent. He doesn't see it strategically important. We're at the time of George Kennan here, I guess, where he's thinking about the Cold War as being very much an East-West Cold War, and Europe being the centre of power. And Kennan coming out with his long telegram around this time saying, we need to concentrate on industrial centres, and South Asia isn't really an area of great strategic importance. So yeah, it's possible, and I think more work can be done on that. It's just I haven't come across any evidence myself that suggests that that's really what happened. It seemed to be more. I guess it's interesting when you think of conspiracism as well, that sometimes we construct, maybe this was a grand plan, and often when I've investigated that, it actually just tends to be sort of just happen chance, really, or just ineptitude on the part of bureaucracies rather than grand conspiracies. We all get things wrong in our lives, I guess, and bureaucracies tend to do that as well, and that seems to be, well, from the available evidence, and what's happened here. But yeah, if it is something else, that would be really fascinating and really interesting. And I guess it's possible. It's perfectly possible that is the case. Sorry, I'm taking too long, Artie. So, yeah, reframing East-West binary. We talked about this before, but I really think South Asia is important and overlooked because of its geography as well. And this equally applies to Pakistan, and we don't really need to talk when the president ordered about the geopolitics of Pakistan and why its location is incredibly significant in terms of the United States in the context of the early Cold War. I think that goes without saying. But in India, I think there is a notion that because of its non-aligned status and the number of technicians, diplomats, educators, journalists that are coming to India, particularly I think from the mid 1950s onwards, really, from the Eastern Bloc, so from Russia, but also from Czechoslovakia and East Germany, and from the United States, United Kingdom. Lots of literature at the time in India about Delhi being a sort of melting pot, really, a Cold War melting pot, very similar to Berlin. So this hub in South Asia where it's very easy to recruit spies because there are lots of Americans, there are lots of British people there, but there are also lots of people from Russia and from Eastern Europe all coming together. So Indian newspapers at the time actually called Delhi the Berlin of the East. This notion that it's a really easy place to operate in espionage terms. It's a really easy place to recruit agents. It's a sort of spy hub, really. And so I think that just the geography of it is interesting, but it's sort of been overlooked, I think, in the literature. One of the other things that I think was really interesting that I picked up in the book that I wasn't really aware of. So I think most people know that Stalin's daughter Svetlana Aliyeva defected from Russia to the United States in March 1967, and she defected through New Delhi. So I'll talk a bit about that later, perhaps. But the geopolitics of defection, I think, is really interesting. So we mentioned before Berlin Wall goes up in 1961, and it becomes much more difficult for people from the East to defect to the West across Europe. So the Iron Curtain's been there since 1947, but it becomes a much more intimidating barrier really after the early 1960s. So the flow of defections from east to west really dries up in Europe from the 1960s. But at exactly the same time, it escalates dramatically in India. So India becomes a real hub for Cold War defection and quite prominent Cold War defections all the way through the 1960s. And that is deeply problematic for the Indian government. It's trying to maintain a sense of non-alignment between East and West. But lots of people from the East, and predominantly this is East-West defection, and very few people going West to East. So it becomes a real sense of embarrassment for the Indian government that lots of Soviet, East German, Czechoslovakian citizens are coming to Delhi. And the reason they're coming to Delhi is because they can then defect to the West. So it becomes a real pleasure. And the Soviet embassy in Delhi gets really upset by this. There's protests. It becomes a real sticking point or a point of friction in the relationship between India and Moscow. And I don't think that's really been covered. The sense to which the geopolitics of defection is really important in the Cold War relationship has really been covered so much before. I put this image up for those any John le Carré fans out there. The British spy author John le Carré has written quite a lot about intelligence. Died relatively recently. So le Carré is really influential in terms of the British intelligence culture, I think, and sort of documenting from a fictional perspective British intelligence in the Cold War, and quite a cynical approach to that. But interestingly, le Carré, one of le Carré's most famous books, I guess, is called Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which was written in the 1970s. And in 1979, that's serialized on British television. So this is some of you know Patrick Stewart from Star Trek and the X-Men, and Alec Guinness here from Star Wars, if we're going to go for science fiction sort of films. But that adaptation is broadcast on British television in 1979. And it's interesting. This is a scene from, it's supposed to be in Tihar jail in New Delhi, where Carla, this is Patrick Stewart, Carla is a Soviet KGB officer. George Smiley from British intelligence tries to persuade Carla to defect from Russia to the West. And that process of that process of trying to get that defection to happen plays out in Tihar jail in New Delhi. I think it's interesting because up until this point, there isn't really much comment in academic intelligence literature about India being a hub for Cold War defection. But le Carré, in a fictional sense, is basically nodding and hinting that this happened, this took place, and it was significant. I think it's really interesting that Le Carre says this is probably one of the biggest defections in his. I mean, he writes lots of books, but this is one of the most famous scenes, I guess, in one of the John Le Carre's books. This potential defection of Carla, really integral to that sort of seminal novel. And you might expect it to be set in East Germany or elsewhere in Europe, but it's not. It's set in South Asia. And I think that's really important because he's giving a nod to basically saying, look, the politics of defection has shifted, and it's shifted to South Asia and to the global South more generally. And it's almost like fiction getting ahead of, or non-fiction getting ahead of sort of fiction, really. This notion that Le Carre is hinting to that when no one's writing about that in academic circles. And interestingly, of course, John Le Carre was an MI5 officer and an officer of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 as well. So he's worked in the secret world. And sometimes I think you can go back and have a look at popular culture, and it tells you something about intelligence that academic writing at that time isn't really saying. So that was interesting. The other thing is, one of the big points I wanted to talk about was this notion of South-South networks. I spoke a bit about it at the start. I was really not aware of the extent to which India had intelligence liaison relationships across the global South. I think it's fascinating. It's really interesting. I think it's really important. And I think we know very, very little about it. So I think it's a great focus for future research. And this also applies to Pakistan as well. You know, are countries in the global South, how are they trying to circumvent control from the United States, the CIA, British intelligence, SOS, but also Soviet intelligence, the KGB, the GRU? How are they trying to give themselves freedom of action outside of those big superpower intelligence services in the Cold War? And part of the way they're doing that is to get connections within the global South. So in India's case, for example, India helped Ghana form its first intelligence. Ghana comes independent in 1957 from the United Kingdom. In 1958, interestingly, at a Commonwealth Prime Minister's conference in London. So the British unwittingly facilitate this link. Kwame Nkrumah, who's Ghana's Prime Minister, approaches Nehru and says, I would like your help in forming an independent intelligence service, because MI5 have approached me and the CIA have approached me to help me set up this service, but I don't want the Americans or the British to set up a service because inevitably they'll penetrate it. It'll be compromised. I want a truly independent service. Can you help me? And Nehru says yes. And Indian Intelligence Bureau officers, actually R.N. Kao, the famous raw officer, goes to Ghana in the 1950s and helps set up the first independent Ghanaian intelligence service, the Foreign Service Research Bureau. This is another point. I think it'd be a great research project for someone. The sort of the naming of intelligence agencies, like the Research and Analysis Wing in India, deliberately named to be as nondescript as possible. The Foreign Service Research Bureau in Ghana. They are not calling these things. The British call it the Secret Intelligence Service. The CIA call it the Central Intelligence Agency. But very few people in the global South or intelligence agencies in the global South have that naming. It's a quite interesting sort of approach, really. But the other thing I found was links to Cuba. So Latin America, India formed intelligence links with Salvador Allende's Chile before Allende was killed and deposed in 1973, but also with Fidel Castro's Cuba as well. So interesting connections in intelligence terms, offering mutual support to each other during the Cold War, which I think is a fascinating topic. Very, very little literature on this, but I think it's really, really important. So something for future study, I think. I mentioned before framing. So I'll make one point here. And this is, I think, this notion of chronology is really being dictated by the West, a very Anglo-centric approach to chronologies. So in the book I called 1967 India's Year of Intelligence. There's a general election in India, a national election in 1967, and during that election there's lots of talk of foreign interference. The CIA trying to swing the election towards right-wing Indian parties, the KGB and the GRU, Soviet intelligence agencies, trying to do the same, bribing Indian politicians, putting propaganda in Indian newspapers to try and support their preferred candidate. So a sense in the Indian press that lots of foreign intelligence interference is going on in trying to shape India's democracy in 1967. And up until 1967, there hadn't really been, the CIA didn't really feature in the Indian press. If you look for Indian newspapers in the 1950s and you word search them on various sort of portals, you won't really find much mention of the CIA. After 1967, if you search an Indian newspaper, you'll get the CIA appearing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. The CIA was literally on the front pages of every Indian newspaper from 1967 onwards, really, and still until relatively recently. It was a really important phenomenon in terms of India's public diplomacy. So 67, I think, is a pivotal point. It's a point of inflection where before 1967, the CIA manages to keep under the radar in India. After 1967, it becomes part of India's political culture, and becomes very politicized in India. And partly that's to do with the general election in 1967 and the extent to which there was accusations of foreign interference in that election. So this is a couple of examples from the Times of India after 1967, where we just get the CIA appearing regularly in the Indian press, and that continues for the remainder of the Cold War, really, during that period. It's a quite interesting sort of shift in terms of public perceptions of intelligence in India and the CIA. Right, I'm going to take a brief diversion here, very brief, because I know I'm talking too long. But this is the Chancery building of the American Embassy in New Delhi. So I think it was built in the late 1950s, mid to late 1950s. So quite modernist architecture. And it's got a big pool in front of it. And that pool, remarkably, was supposed to represent sort of a Mughal garden. I don't think they really pulled it off. I think it's a pretty poor imitation of a Mughal garden, but this is the Chancery building in New Delhi. And the reason I'm putting this up is it tells us something about the Central Intelligence Agency in India during this period. So this is a duck. So hands up, who thought there would be a slide of a duck in an intelligence presentation? Probably not very many people, but this duck is really important in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency in India, believe it or not. Not this exact duck. I couldn't get a picture of a duck from the 1960s. It would have been a very old duck. So this is a duck. This is actually an Indian duck, I think, but not from this period. But in the 1960s, so remember 1967, I think, is this inflection point for the Central Intelligence Agency. So 1965, we know 1965, war between India and Pakistan breaks out. So quite a tense period in the subcontinent. In 1965, the New York Times reporter in New Delhi is a guy called Tony Lucas. He's quite a prominent reporter in the New York Times, has been posted all over the world, but he pitches up in New Delhi in 1965 to cover India for the New York Times. And lots is happening in 1965, so Lucas is getting on the front page quite a lot. But before conflict breaks out between India and Pakistan, Lucas is really struggling to get stories into the New York Times, and he's ambitious and he wants to get stories on the front page of the New York Times. So he comes across an incident at the American Embassy in Delhi, where a number of ducks have occupied the big pool in front of the Chancery building, and they're multiplying and they're flourishing and they're creating a real problem. So they're making a mess of the Chancery building, they're clogging up the filters in the lake, they're generally being a nuisance. And the American ambassador says, well, we need to cull these ducks. We need to basically get rid of these ducks, and if necessary, we need to humanely kill these ducks. And lots of staff in the American Embassy are really unhappy about this. There's quite a few ornithologists and bird lovers, and they launch a campaign to save the ducks of the American Embassy. And it becomes quite a public campaign. And the leading figure in that campaign is a CIA officer in the American Embassy. So Tony Lucas gets hold of the story and says, this is quite a funny story. This is quite a human interest story. I'll write about it and hopefully it'll get published. And it does. It gets published prominently in the New York Times. And protest saves Indian fowl from becoming a curry. And it's a bit sort of light-hearted, a bit sort of orientalist really, and it's sort of thing. But what Lucas does is he mentions that the Central Intelligence Agency staff here have circulated a petition. So he basically mentions the fact that the CIA are behind a petition to save the ducks, and he confirms that the Central Intelligence Agency have a station in the embassy in New Delhi. So this is the first time any newspaper in India or the United States has confirmed that this is happening. The next day, after this story appears in the New York Times, Lucas is called into the American Embassy by the Deputy Chief of Mission and is told he's being expelled from India within the next 24 hours. And Lucas says, why? What have I done? Why are you expelling me? I've done nothing wrong. And the Deputy Chief of Mission produces this copy of the New York Times and says, this is what you've done. You've confirmed that the CIA is operating in India. And Lucas is just incredulous. He says, the rickshaw driver that brought me here knows that the CIA is operating in India. Everyone I speak to knows that the CIA is operating in India. And he's told, yes, but it's not been printed officially in a newspaper. I think the point I'm trying to make here is in 1965, you just didn't mention the CIA in India. In 1967, they were on the front page of every Indian newspaper almost every single day. So it's a big shift, really, in terms of sort of public acknowledgement of the CIA. The politics of intelligence in India shifts quite quickly in a very short period of time. He doesn't get sent home from India, he actually sort of begs to stay, and he's kept in India. But there's a really interesting account that Lucas writes, which is in the Harrison Salisbury papers at Columbia University, the Butler Library at Columbia University. Lucas is absolutely horrified that he's treated this way by the American government, the CIA, and holds a sort of a grudge against them, really, from that point onwards. So politics of intelligence is possible. We mentioned that Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Alexeyeva, defects to the West in 1967. So big issue for 1967. Another reason why it could be regarded as a year of intelligence. The other reason is, I think I'm putting 1967 as an inflection point, is because it's the point when Soviet propaganda and sort of black propaganda really takes off in India. So at the moment, there's lots of talk about Putin and black propaganda and use of disinformation in the war in Ukraine and otherwise. So this notion that the Soviets are quite adept at using propaganda and disinformation to undermine and to smear their adversaries in a contemporary 21st century context. But, in intelligence, nothing is really new. And if we go back to the 1960s in India, in 1967, the Soviets, and this is, I think, the KGB, but it could be GRU, are really putting out lots of forgeries in the Indian press for the first time, trying to smear British and American officials. So we get a sort of a black propaganda war on the use of forgeries, really becoming significant in India, really, for the first time in 1967. This is actually a telegram. It's a really bad copy, sorry, but it's the best one I've got. This is a Soviet forgery from probably from the KGB. So this is a document that the KGB produced in India. They probably produced it in Moscow, sent it to India in a diplomatic pouch. And this document claims to be a telegram from John Freeman, the British High Commissioner in India, back to London. And in that telegram, Freeman is saying that, yes, the United States is interfering in Indian elections. Yes, the CIA are bribing Indian officials. Yes, the British are involved in this as well. So it appears on first look to be a complete confession by the British High Commissioner. All this sort of internal interference is taking place on the part of British and American security and intelligence services to impact the Indian election in 1967. So a really important document. It arrives at the Indian Express newspaper offices in New Delhi in a brown paper envelope without an address on, and it's given to a journalist. And he opens the envelope and he finds this telegram and immediately publishes it and says, this is horrendous. This shows that the CIA are up to no good in India and have been interfering in the election. So it's printed in the newspaper, but it's a clear forgery. It's an absolute forgery by the John Freeman, who's the Indian High Commissioner, says, it's on first look, it's quite a plausible forgery, but nevertheless, it is a forgery. And if you have a look at it, a couple of things really. In here, they mention the Foreign Office, but obviously India is part of the Commonwealth, so the Foreign Office doesn't cover members of the Commonwealth. It should be the Commonwealth Office. So the Soviet forgeries have got that wrong. They've just misinterpreted it. It shouldn't be Foreign Office. It should be Commonwealth Office. So that's a mistake. More technically, they've referred to things like UK Mission New York. That's never put on a British telegram in the 1960s. It's always called UK Miss. So they've made a mistake there. But the biggest faux pas, and the most obvious faux pas for anyone really, is they've called John Freeman Sir John Freeman, because they assume that any British diplomat would have been knighted. Now, John Freeman was appointed by Harold Wilson, the British Labour politician. He was a former editor of the New Statesman, a left-wing publication in the United Kingdom. He doesn't hold any truck with the honours system, and Freeman would never agree to be knighted. So basically, he's a Labour politician, a socialist. He doesn't believe in the honours system. He's never been knighted. He is not Sir John Freeman. But they've just assumed, well, he's a diplomat, so therefore he must be Sir John Freeman. So quite clearly a sort of, a messy forgery, really. Interestingly, the British think this is hilarious and quite funny, and they don't take it particularly seriously. So this is Joe Garner, who's an Undersecretary at the Commonwealth Office. He says, this is a really interesting document, but, the writing style, it's quite an interesting document when you read it. It is quite a sort of old English style, I think. So that's another reason why it's a forgery. But the British approach to this is, and this is interesting, I think, in a 21st century context as well. How do you deal with disinformation? How do you approach intelligence disinformation? Do you amplify it and give it the oxygen of publicity by pointing out that this is a forgery, by making a big thing about it in newspapers, by protesting to the government you think is responsible? Do you give it that sort of level of credence and publicity? The British say no. The best way of dealing with this is just to ignore it. It will go away quickly. Just pretend it hasn't happened. It's probably not going to have much impact on Indian public opinion. However, so that's the British response, which I think lots of people in intelligence circles today would say is probably, on balance, the right way to deal with this information. Don't amplify it. Don't give it the oxygen of publicity. Don't make it into a bigger thing than it actually is. The Americans think very differently. So the American embassy, Chester Bowles is the guy on the right, that is the American ambassador at the time. He gets very exercised by this and claims that it's a disgusting smear on the United States, and there are big complaints to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. He publishes columns in newspapers in India, excoriating the Soviet Union for using forgery and black propaganda in India. So he turns it into this enormous public issue in India and blows it out of all proportion, I think. So interesting, different responses. One of the reasons I think Bowles gets so upset and makes a big thing of this is he thinks the man responsible for this forgery is a guy called Yuri Modin. Now, Yuri Modin is a KGB officer who sort of is most famous for being the controller of the Cambridge Five. So the Cambridge Five spy ring in sort of 1950s England, which is Guy Burgess and Kim Philby and John Carecross, Anthony Blunt, Donald Maclean. There's sort of 5 members of the British establishment that served in MI5, SIS, the British Foreign Office, all senior figures in the British establishment who turned out to be Soviet moles, Soviet agents recruited at Cambridge University in the 1930s. Their controller is Yuri Modin from the KGB. Now, Modin, once they're blown in the 1950s and they're revealed as the Soviet sort of agents, and their treachery is revealed, Modin sort of disappears for a while. But then he pops back up in India in 1966 in the Soviet embassy. And the number of forgeries and black propaganda operations starts skyrocketing in India when Modi's there in 1966. And Bowles just says, this is clearly the work of Yuri Modin. This is Modin up to his old tricks again, and he's trying to smear the United States. And so the IRD, I mentioned the Information Research Department's sort of black propaganda arm of Britain in the Cold War. They think the forgery is an Indian communist just because it's so clumsy. They think, the KGB would never have made a mistake of calling John Freeman Sir John Freeman. It's just your amateur. It's an amateur, and the KGB are better than that. So the British think, don't make a big thing of it, because actually we just think this is probably a local operation. It's just gone badly. But the Americans think, no, this is definitely the KGB, and they're definitely up to no good in the Cold War. And they pass lots of information. They put huge pressure on the Indian government to take punitive action against the Soviet embassy, for example. And the Indians have just got absolutely no interest in taking any action against the Soviet Union. They want this whole thing to go away, really. But, the CIA, interestingly, launched a counter-propaganda campaign. So they control newspapers. Obviously, the CIA are funding and controlling newspapers in India during the Cold War. And one of them is called Young India. And they publish a whole expose of Yuri Modin in Young India in 1967, basically calling out the Soviet embassy for conducting black propaganda operations in India. And it just amplifies the whole thing and blows it out of proportion. That means it runs and runs and runs in the Indian press, really. So interestingly, at 67 becomes, for various reasons, a really important inflection point, I think, in the Cold War in South Asia. I make that point because and I called it the year of intelligence deliberately, because there is another year of intelligence, for those of you who are familiar with intelligence history, and that's 1975. And 1975 is the American year of intelligence. It's the year that the Central Intelligence Agency wrongdoing during the Cold War is revealed. Lots of documents are leaked to New York Times. New York Times publishes a big expose about coups the CIA has orchestrated in Iran and Guatemala, and attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and all the CIA's dirty laundry gets aired in the mid-1970s. And we have the Church Senate inquiry into intelligence that takes place. The Pike Committee convenes in the House of Representatives. So 1975 becomes the year the CIA's activity globally becomes a really big issue in the United States domestically, and 1975 becomes the so-called year of intelligence. Again, completely Western-centric view of this. And interestingly, I think India has a year of intelligence, and it's 8 years before that, in 1967. But you read nothing about that in the literature. So again, thinking about turning the lens slightly and thinking about chronologies being different. Yeah, we talked about collaboration and resistance. Again, I'm not going to go over that too long because we've talked about it before, but I think that the key point here is this extent to which after 1967, and particularly under Indira Gandhi in the early 1970s, intelligence becomes really politicized. So this is a cartoon by Lakshman from the Times of India. And I just emphasize, I think, the fact that many Indian politicians see intelligence as a really significant and convenient scapegoat for any type of domestic ill. So if the economy crashes, or if something, if there's a military or strategic setback, they always blame it on the Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, there's one cartoon by Lakshman, I think, that says there's a cyclone in Orissa. Well, that must be the CIA. The CIA gets blamed for everything, even weather and the environment gets blamed on the CIA. So I think that's interesting because the Indian politicians fall back on the habit of blaming foreign intelligence agencies in a foreign hand. And certainly some of that is true. The CIA was interfering in India, certainly during the 50s and 60s. I think less so in the 1970s, interestingly. It's still going on, though. But I think amplifying it, exaggerating it, using it as a scapegoat in every situation, it does have a really big impact on the way people think about intelligence in India generally. But it also, I think, erodes trust and confidence in broader democratic sort of institutions within the subcontinent. So the socio-political effect of that is significant. And I don't think Indian politicians who are using it sort of tactically and are using it sort of in a fairly cavalier fashion really comprehend the deeper and longer term impact on Indian politics and Indian society that comes from this evocation of the foreign hand and the extent to which it's done. So I think there's a bigger issue going on in that sense. Yeah, so impact we talked about before. I think three things I'd say. I'm not very good at impact, so not really as convincing about this. But one is, I think Washington loses the intelligence narrative in India. So again, we're thinking about agency. Who's really winning the intelligence Cold War in terms of public diplomacy in India in the 1970s? I think Indira Gandhi is winning it hands down, that she's accusing Washington of all sorts of misdeeds, some true, the vast majority not true, but she's using it quite effectively to alienate Indian opinion against the United States more generally through targeting the Central Intelligence Agency, and she's using it quite effectively as a domestic political tool within India as well to sort of marginalize arguments advanced by political opponents. So who's in control of the intelligence narrative? I think the Indians are in the 1970s, and I think they're showing their agency quite effectively because of the politics of India. When I touched on the question, does the Cold War matter in intelligence terms? I'm not really sure it does. I mean, this is terrible for an intelligence historian to say, but the IRD, the Information Research Department, who's the British propaganda arm in India, they have been written about very little. So again, one of those areas where intelligence isn't really covered. The IRD starts working in India in the 1940s, and it only suspends its operations in India in the 1977. So the idea is operating for decades and decades and decades in India. It's covert, it's undeclared, it's a secret intelligence operation that the Indian government doesn't know about, the British launching in India. So it's by far, I think, the longest and the most significant covert intelligence operation mounted by British intelligence in Cold War India. And we know very, very little about it. But the IRD, they engaged in grey propaganda, but also forgeries and black propaganda as well. But when they were coming to the tail end of their time in India in the 1970s, they were asked to justify what they had achieved. Quite a lot of money is spent on IRD in India. It's quite a big operation, and interestingly, it runs substantial political risks. I mean, I'm sort of amazed to some degree that the British felt able or thought it was a good idea to run such a large covert intelligence operation in India, because had it been discovered, it would have been a massive political scandal. I mean, a huge political scandal, and undoubtedly would have severely impacted diplomatic relations between the United Kingdom and India. It had the sort of scale of this interference in India's internal politics. Had it come out, I think it would have been a massive issue for any Indian government, and they would have had to respond to it quite forcefully, I think, during that period. The idea is asked, well, given the risks we're running with this operation, what did you achieve? And they're able to point to no specific achievement during the whole Cold War period. The best they can do is to use an agricultural analogy. So they basically say, we're not sure any of the propaganda activities we conducted, forgeries, black propaganda group, we're not sure it actually made any difference at all. But we compare it to a crop. We know the crop's grown, but we're not sure if the fertilizer we put on that crop made it grow, or if it was the sun or the rain or any other environmental factors. We really can't tell you if we made a difference. And that's interesting because lots of people in Whitehall are really skeptical about this operation, this propaganda operation. And they note that the idea has compared itself to fertilizer. And they say, well, that's interesting. We also think that IDEA spent most of its time spreading manure around the world. So they're sort of criticized for that ability, really. The other thing I point to is intelligence failures on the part of the West. So Smiling Buddha in his nuclear test in 1974 is missed by British intelligence, and it's missed by the Central Intelligence Agency. So the Research Analysis Wing and the Indian government do a really good job of disguising that nuclear test, and Washington's taken by surprise. So I think it speaks against this notion of blowing intelligence agencies up and inflating their omnipotence and inflating their capabilities. In India, but in 1974, the CIA is regarded as this evil sort of omnipotent organization that knows everything that's going on the subcontinent, that's controlling people's lives, that is influencing elections. But actually, in actuality, the CIA can't even predict a nuclear test in 1974. So, how powerful is the CIA really in terms of subcontinent? Not very, if you take that as evidence, really, I think. So interesting. So, one final thought, and then I'll end. So this is a comment, I think, by Anand Niswal. So I came across him. He's just an average citizen of Mumbai in 1952, and he writes to an American politician, and just talking about the Cold War, and just emphasising this sense of this being an East-West intelligence conflict in India from Washington, Moscow's, and London's perspective. But actually, from an average Indian perspective, they are really not engaged with an ideological Cold War. I think that's significant because I think intelligence agencies were trying to channel ideology as a means of engaging Indian citizens with this intelligence Cold War, and it simply didn't resonate. I think many Indians were much more concerned about economics, about jobs, about their daily lives. They weren't really engaged with an intelligence Cold War. And because of that, I think, we go all the way back, I guess, the SIS officer in New Delhi in 1947, that lack of sensitivity or empathy to what average South Asians were thinking and feeling and what was important to them in the context of the Cold War really meant that many intelligence agencies misdirected their efforts and were targeting the wrong audiences, weren't being particularly effective. One really final example about this, when we talk about British propaganda, the British propaganda organisations and the British High Commission continually complained throughout the course of the Cold War that all the material they were sent that was sent to South Asia for them to feed into the Indian press was completely inappropriate. I remember on one occasion they received a whole load of material that the British Foreign Office said, can you make sure this material appears in the Indian press? Because we think it's really impactful and it paints communism in a bad light. And the High Commission opened this envelope with all this material, and it was about suppression of Catholics in Bulgaria. And then the British High Commission said, why on earth do you think the average Indian is going to be at all interested in suppression of Catholic minorities in Bulgaria? It's simply not going to resonate. But it speaks to this East-West mindset, I think, in the Cold War and their inability to really understand what's going on in South Asia. Right, I will finish there. Thank you very much for indulging me. I know I've talked for too long, but I'm more than willing to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. This has been really fascinating. And I think, I have notes and notes of pages filled up here. And I'm really tempted, to ask a lot of questions, but perhaps we need an in-person conversation whenever we get to meet. I would be definitely interested, for our conversation about, the thought processes about nuclear weapons development post 1962 war in India, and if there was any British intel about that, that would be one way, of my interest. But there's like so much here, with respect to non-aligned movement and, fascinating stuff from history, as to how, on the face of it, India still champions the non-aligned movement. But now, I did not know about all this evidence that exists out there, which speaks of a bit of a tilt. So that's interesting. And also, India setting up intelligence agencies, in these countries that you've mentioned, and these countries, obviously had a very clear Cold War side. So how does that fit into the entire NAM thing? Because you just made a statement that, it wasn't about East-West, but was it really not about East-West at the end of the day? So, perhaps a different perspective to look at it. And also, thank you for introducing popular culture and that point about as to how popular culture can sometimes, even unwittingly, not based on any thorough research, can guide academics into, looking at more sources and then, come up with more evidence. So a lot there, it's like I just cannot even, it's been really fascinating, really a great, great learning experience for all of us. I will now open the floor for questions and I will take two at a time so that you can take notes and answer two, and then we move to the next set. So over to you, Bilal. Should I close this screen sharing? Just
Oh, yes. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
all right.
I'm audible to you?
Yes, you are audible, Fazal.
First of all, thanks, Dr. Rabia, Ali, and the entire team of CISPR to provide this fabulous interactive session and try to engage with one of the best fabric available on the intelligence, like Dr. Paul. And secondly, I'm also grateful, Dr. Paul, for this wonderful, very comprehensive presentation covering Global South, particularly predominantly on Indian perspective. So my question, Dr. Paul, my question in the backdrop of you are one of the core research area, that is British and American intelligence intervention in South and modern Global South. In the context of that, my question is, what kind of cognitive biases has developed in Global South regarding trust or mistrust of Western intelligence, and what kind of impact on Indo-Pakistan rivalry? Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you so much, Bilal. Ali?
Thank you, Dr. Paul, for a fabulous and riveting lecture. I like the way I liked how you started off with the with Nehru's mantra, "Asians for Asia," Asia for Asians, with that picture. So uh, a decade ago, I read or used part of Ashoka Raina's book Inside Raw, and it talked about in detail. It talked about how much before 1971, Indian intelligence had spread its tentacles in West Bengal and East Pakistan. And the British had a great role to play in Bengal starting from the 1800, starting from 1508. Uh, so my question is that you have talked in great detail about the cooperation between British and Indian intelligence. How far did British intelligence knowledge of Bengal helped India cultivate those intelligence tentacles and networks inside of East Pakistan and West Bengal? Did you, while doing research, did you come across any linkages which really helped India do what it did in 19? In fact, starting from Agartala, what it did post Agartala and in 1971. That's my question.
Thank you. Over to you, Paul.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Ravi. So, Bilal, your first question about cognitive biases and trust. Yeah, I think it's really important. I think intelligence activity probably tactically, I don't think it had much impact. I think the point I was trying to make, which I think you picked up on, was I think it has a really big social, cultural impact within South Asia, and I think both India and Pakistan. So I think one of the key elements is to just fuel conspiracism. So to fuel this notion that there is a foreign hand that's interfering in every facet of political, economic, cultural life in the subcontinent, and to some extent that is a valid point. I mean, the Central Intelligence Agency was conducting lots of intelligence interventions, both in India and Pakistan. It was funding newspapers, it was funding political organizations, educational and scientific organizations as well, receiving funding from the CIA, some witting, some unwitting. And I think 1967, I didn't make this point, it's interesting because that's the period in which revelations in the United States, Ramparts magazine, which is a West Coast magazine in the United States, it's fed information from former CIA officers about what the CIA has been doing globally. And here I'm talking about funding organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other organizations across the globe, really. And India and Pakistan, as part of those revelations, it emerges that the CIA has been funding journalists, newspapers, educational institutions, etc., both in India and in Pakistan. And I think those revelations, they send shockwaves through both countries, really, in 1967. I don't think the scale of those operations is particularly significant, certainly not in global terms, in terms of where the CIA is putting most of its money and influence during those periods. But it does have the impact of confirming or reinforcing this notion that a foreign hand is really important in that context. So it's very corrosive in terms of trust, public trust, in terms of national institutions, but also sort of subnational institutions as well. So I think that does have a big impact. I think also revelations that come out during the Cold War do have a direct impact on the relationship between India and Pakistan and their tensions between the two. So, at various points, the CIA appears to be cooperating with one side and not the other. So in the 1950s, for example, there's a big narrative in India, about SIS cooperating with the Central Intelligence Agency, and that against India, and that fuels paranoia in India. At certain points in the 1960s, when the relationship between ISI and the CIA is not as close, and India is working more closely with the CIA, particularly after the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Lots of discontent and concern in Pakistan about what that means in terms of how the United States might be facilitating or supporting Indian operations back into Pakistan. So I think the CIA sort of acts as a sort of football that sits in the political football that sits in between India and Pakistan, and does amplify and concerns about notions of conspiracism and subversion. And I think partly that's due to the Central Intelligence Agency, partly it's to do with individuals and organizations in both countries that wittingly take funding from the Central Intelligence Agency. But it is a really big component of that relationship, I think, between India and Pakistan, and one that I think merits more study. I mentioned before that I've done some work on India and Pakistan as a in terms of the Cold War. In intelligence terms, I've really only focused on India so far, but have lots of material information on the intelligence Cold War in Pakistan. So yeah, it'd be great as a future project to explore the extent to which that really is a significant factor, not only in individual societies in both India and Pakistan, but also in terms of bilateral relationship as well. It's a really fruitful area for future study, I think. So thank you for that question. It's a really important topic. And I think the question on 1971, yeah, well, interesting. I mean, obviously, Rawls formed in September 1968, and really from that point, RNCOW is really focused on events on Pakistan's on India's eastern borders and what's going on in East Pakistan. So really from that point, RAW is planning propaganda operations, is making contingency plans for intervention potentially with guerrilla forces into Bengal. So that process, I think, begins quite early on in 1968. Once Rawls formed in September 1968, it goes further. I haven't found any information. I found lots of really interesting information on the research analysis wing in archives in India. I mean, surprisingly, in the private papers, for example, of P.N. Haksar, which are in the Nehru Memorial Library in Delhi. Axios has quite a lot of information about 1971 and the operations of Indian intelligence and when their planning for covert operations in India, in East Pakistan actually begins. So quite a lot of material on that from an Indian perspective. And there is quite a lot of material in British archives, in the British National Archives in Kew, about intelligence liaison. But I haven't come across anything specifically which shows British intelligence agencies feeding back information to the Research and Analysis Wing, for example, that would have been helpful to them in terms of planning their operations in 1971. I probably think actually that the Secret Intelligence Service presence in Bengal, both in India and in East Pakistan, is actually not particularly effective during that period. So the British are, I mean, and I say this because not particularly in terms of the 1971 conflict, but here I'm talking more about the Naxalite rebellions in eastern India and the Naxalite sort of insurgency that takes place. And the British reporting on that is really quite poor. And that sort of indicates that the British are scrabbling around for knowledge. They don't have information on what's going on with the Naxalite uprising. And it's important to bring because it does affect British interests, both commercial interests in Bengal, but also a number of British diplomats are kidnapped, for example, at that time. So the British are really worried about what the Naxalites are up to. But they have very, very poor intelligence in northeastern India. So I think probably that points to the fact that actually they're not British sort of input into Indian intelligence is not particularly significant in 1971.
Excellent. Hassan and then Moaz, please.
Thank you, Paul. It was a good, excellent learning for all of us. I was actually looking forward to your book, and I've been bugging Ali for it since I first get to know about it. You mentioned in your lecture about the Cold War era, particularly in India as the battleground for the American as well as the Soviet intelligence community. And in the 40s, if we see when both countries got their independence, both inclined towards the CIA and from the British hands, it moved from British hands to the CIA. And but still, we saw there was a war between both the nations on Kashmir, an issue that has been there, and till date, it's become one of the trigger points for a nuclear war now, an unattended subject. And then in the 60s, we saw that when 65 war and 62 war, Americans they shift their attention more towards Pakistan, stopped the aid to India, and the KGB got the opportunity. And you were mentioning about the 60s where KGB was very active. So this particular shift, we saw the 70s, we saw the 71 war. India got aid from the KGB, and obviously Pakistan got from the Americans, somewhat, as they say. We're still waiting for the 7th Fleet. Then this about this Afghanistan, when the Russians were defeated and the KGB got dismantled and all. So this whole shift, do you think now the present day Federation, Russian Federation and FSB and the other who are active, still using tactics like these of selecting the sites within a community? We saw, I mean, what I mean to ask is, we saw the Communist Party of India flourishing. It is still exists till date, and they have a number of states under them. Whereas Communist Party of Pakistan was eliminated as soon as they launched. And same thing happened in Indonesia also. So do you think the FSB currently seeking the crisis in the Middle East and the Ukraine, Russia, still it is going on, the Cold War in some form is still going on or not?
All right, thank you, Hassan. I hope
Thanks,
you got all of it. We'll just take one more question from Moaz, and then there's one in the chat we can get to later on. Moaz, over to you.
Thank you, sir, for such a fabulous and comprehensive lecture. My question is, we have seen the intelligence agency of India has been involved in illegal assassinations of separatist leaders, particularly Sikh leaders, in Canada, in United States of America, and in other countries of the West. So, in your view, how such events has negatively affected the image of Ra in Western intelligence circles? Thank you.
Thank you, Moaz. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Ravi. So yeah, Hassan, it's a really good question, actually. In answer to your question, I think there is, I think we've mentioned nothing really new in intelligence. And I think intelligence is usually conducted over such a long time frame. So you have tactical intelligence, but strategic intelligence. I think actually the sort of battle for just if we think about South Asian intelligence, for example, you could argue there's been and it's always been intelligence has been a really really important factor in South Asia, but in sort of modern terms, Russia under the Tsarist Empire has been the so-called Great Game, where it's battling Britain, the British Empire, for influence in Afghanistan and northern India, which dates from sort of the 19th century. That's always been going on, and I don't think that's really changed. So I think you're absolutely right to point that sort of sense of continuity out, in that the Russian FSB and the SVR are very active and have very strong liaison relationships with the research analysis wing, and that's always been the case. And that's an interesting constant, really. I mean, I think probably that sense of closer intelligence relationships between Moscow and New Delhi really dates from the sort of late 1960s. And that's always been the case. So where India has gone through its ups and downs with Russia, that intelligence has always been a constant, I think. So the SVR and the FSB have those relationships with India. They're keen to cultivate them. I think that's something that they're very interested in, and they're also, they've got a very big interest in Afghanistan as well. So there is. Particularly during this period of American occupation in Afghanistan, I think there was an intelligence Cold War being conducted by the intelligence service of the United States and the FSB and the SVR. That's a constant. I don't think that's ever going to change. I think they are heavily involved in the region and still are both sets of intelligence services. So, yeah, I think it is important. It needs watching, and I think it's something that is probably not going to go away anytime soon. I think both. Russia, Putin's Russia, and also Washington really regards South Asia as an incredibly important strategic area. And so if anything, the intelligence footprint of both of those sides is growing in South Asia, I think it has grown over the last decade or so, because South Asia is becoming economically, politically, strategically, again, a really important area of the globe. So I think, any intelligence service is going to focus attention on an area it regards as vital to its strategic interests. And that's certainly the case in South Asia. Interesting question on Raw from Moaz. Yeah, I guess we have to say alleged assassinations conducted by the Research and Analysis Wing on a Canadian citizen in the vicinity of Vancouver who was murdered. Another American national, an attempted assassination plot against Pan Am in New York, again, who is an American citizen. I think that's a really interesting development in many levels, really. One, the extent to which India feels a need to assert its intelligence, its covert action intelligence sort of reach into North America. I mean, I'm surprised in a number of ways, really. Had they been Indian citizens, that might be one thing. I mean, I think that would have been more than serious enough. But the fact that the individual who was murdered was a Canadian citizen, and his links to Khalistan movement aside, and Pan Am is an American citizen, it's absolutely incumbent upon the Canadian government of Justin Trudeau and also the Biden administration of the United States to respond really forcefully to effectively attacks on their own citizens on their own national soil. So in many senses, it's a really reckless move, I think, by the Research and Analysis Wing to expect there not to be a significant reaction from political administrations in Canada and the United States. So whoever was judging the risk reward in New Delhi. And that's an interesting factor as well. How high up the chain does this go in terms of plausible deniability? I mean, I think it's difficult to envisage that at least Ajit wasn't in the know about what was happening here. I mean, if this was really, the Indian government, I think, is trying to present this perhaps as a rogue element within its national security structures, I think that sort of tests the bounds of plausibility, really. I mean, I don't think an operation of that scale would have been conducted by the research analysis wing unless Doval had signed off on it. So we don't know, we can't prove that, but difficult to envisage that wouldn't have been the case. Also interesting that India seems to be using criminal elements as well, so not necessarily research analysis wing officers, but employing criminal, and India has a history of employing members of the Indian underworld to conduct state-sponsored assassinations on its behalf. So this is not something particularly new, but I think the location of that assassination and the fact it targeted an American and a Canadian citizen is really significant in terms of impact. So again, I think that tells us something perhaps about assertive Indian nationalism and the Modi administration's need to maybe assert itself symbolically on the international stage. It does seem to be a paradigm shift in terms of India's willingness to conduct covert action on a global scale, and maybe that feeds into a narrative about global India and assertive Hindu nationalism that's coming out of the Modi government. I mean, up until this point, RAW has conducted foreign operations, but it's tended to be in India's neighbourhood. So we'll think of Sri Lanka and Nepal and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and into Pakistan as well, also, of course. But they tend to be sort of localized operations. The notion of RAW striking so far away in North America is something new, I think, and is a paradigm shift, and also a paradigm shift in terms of risk, I think, in terms of diplomatic risk. But in terms of impact, interestingly, I think the impact in Canada has been significant. I mean, Trudeau has reacted quite strongly to the assassination of Jar. Diplomats have been sent home from Ottawa. India's expelled Canadian diplomats. Still, Trudeau today is reacting quite forcefully to what he regards as an unacceptable behaviour on part of the Indian state. I think the Biden administration, interestingly, has been much more muted in its response and almost wants this to sort of go away. So although Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, has issued several strong warnings to the Modi government, I think, and Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, and Jake Sullivan have been to New Delhi and explicitly met with Doval and Modi and sort of, effectively tried to draw a red line in which, they regard certain Indian behaviour as unacceptable. So any repeat of the attempted assassination of Panam, for example, has been sort of laid down as a red line by the United States administration. That aside, I think the reaction has been very muted. And I think a large part of that is broader geostrategy. I think the United States really is concerned about rising Chinese power. It's worried about Chinese assertiveness in East China. It's worried about Taiwan. And I think really the Biden administration doesn't want this assassination to get in the way of its broader strategic partnership with India. And that also applies to economics as well, of course. So I think really the United States and Canada have responded in different ways, but partly that's because they have different strategic relationships with India, and that sort of feeds into that narrative. So don't know if that's answered your question.
Thank you so much, Paul. In the interest of time, I am going to, this is going to be the last three questions, and we'll take them together. So Simab, you go ahead and ask the question. But there are two questions posted in the chat, which I'm going to read out to you, Paul, and then we'll get to Simab. So one question by one of our students is that, do you believe that role of intelligence has become more pronounced in diplomacy? And do you consider Western intelligence agencies to be primarily responsible for this culture? And the second is, in your research, you emphasize the continued importance of human intelligence. Can you share any examples where traditional espionage outperformed modern technological methods in South Asia, early on human and tech, and with reference to, for example, Pakistan intelligence setups? Have you found any evidence for that? And Simab, over to you for your question before we close the questions.
All right. Hello. My question is majorly on the theoretical side. Since your research focuses South Asian society in general, so my question is related to the cultural differences which exist in South Asian societies. For example, if we talk about India and Pakistan, there are a lot of ethnicities. the South Asian societies are multi-ethnic and multicultural, and to the extent that people prioritize their ethnicities and culture over their national identities. So, does this make any impact on the internal culture of intelligence agencies of these societies, and how does it impact their operations in general or on the national level?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Saida. Yeah, I think one of the points I was trying to make sort of implicitly, but not probably explicitly, is I think one of the handicaps of Western intelligence, and I think the CIA and British intelligence are equally culpable for this, is a lack of sophistication when it comes to engaging with South Asian societies. And I think you make a really good point about the complexity, the diversity, both sort of ethnically, in terms of religion, in terms of social class. All these things are really complicated. So you're absolutely right in terms of how do South Asians identify themselves, what's their primary sort of driver in terms of their own personal identity, and that can vary considerably from region to region, from country to country. I think traditionally both analysts within the Central Intelligence Agency and British intelligence have been poor at interpreting the sort of quite a complex and difficult and also dynamic sort of political and social culture within South Asia. And that has led to lots of missteps. Interestingly, I think and I can point to lots of examples of this during the Cold War, where various American ambassadors, for example, when they received reporting from the Central Intelligence Agency, were horrified about how reductive and simplistic that reporting of South Asia was culturally, politically, and socially. And the same from Britain, really. There was a sort of arrogance, I think, after 1947 that Britain knew South Asia, that Britain had experience of South Asia. But that doesn't really apply to intelligence services, who had really poor, I think, coverage, or really the analysis that you can read from MI5 and MI6 is really not particularly erudite. It's not particularly informed. It tends towards reductive. So I think there is a case that intelligence operations within South Asia, or intelligence interventions, particularly by the United States, United Kingdom, have been compromised and hampered by a really failure to engage with South Asian societies and to deal with the complexities of them. The complexity is almost, I think, overwhelmed the analytical capacity of what are quite, in Britain's case anyway, quite small intelligence and security agencies to deal with that. So I think often they're fallen back on relying on interpretations from ISI or from the research and analysis wing. And of course, as we've discussed from a Western perspective, those interactions are going to be promoting a certain agenda. So I think having a sense of objective analysis has been really, an effective analysis has been really difficult for those intelligence agencies. But that is, again, another, without sort of harping on about, really important area for future research, I think. The extent to which intelligence agencies analytically, but also operationally, have been able to deal with really complex societal structures in the global South. My take is, from the research I've done, is they are not particularly effective at doing that. So it's been, problematic from that perspective, I think, in that one. I think I can't remember what the other question was about human intelligence, I think. So again, Rabia will know much more about this, but I would draw one example on human intelligence. I think human intelligence is really important. So human intelligence, I think, intelligence is a whole spectrum. So we have signals intelligence, communications intelligence, open source intelligence is becoming a much more important component of any intelligence service in the 21st century. But human intelligence is also important as well from that perspective. I think in a South Asian example, there was a tendency, I think, from the 1970s onwards to move towards more technical intelligence and to move away from human intelligence and the cultivation of agents. Partly from an Indian perspective, that was because India became known within American intelligence circles as a much more hostile environment to operate in. So the fact there were many KGB and GRU officers operating in India, the fact that the Indian government was, after 1971 anyway, certainly much more hostile towards American intelligence activity, made it quite difficult for the Central Intelligence Agency to operate and to recruit agents effectively on the ground in India. And because it was hard, I think the CIA moved back from human intelligence and moved towards more technical collection in India. India. But I think that was a mistake. And one example I'll cite, and again, Rabia will know much more about this than I do, but the 1974 nuclear test is not anticipated or predicted by the Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, they know it's going to happen, but they don't get the time right. They don't, it comes as a shock to Washington effectively. And whenever there's an intelligence failure, and any intelligence failure to some extent is a counterintelligence success. So you have to give credit to India and Raw for being quite effective in counterintelligence terms. But nevertheless, the failure to predict that that test is largely because India is very good at anticipating when American satellites are going to fly over Pokhran, the nuclear test site, and they can disguise or camouflage their preparations for the test. They're very good at comms security. So the NSA, the National Security Agency, isn't able to intercept communications by Indian officials that talk about the nuclear test. So the Indians almost go back to a very binary and sort of basic use of communications technology to try and frustrate the National Security Agency in intercepting their communications. And they're very good at it. So the only way you can really get around that is by having an agent inside the program, human intelligence. And the CIA does conduct an inquiry. There's always an intelligence inquiry after an intelligence failure. And the key conclusion from that inquiry is the CIA are not running enough agents in India. So it's human intelligence is the problem. We need to invest more money in human intelligence. And the CIA does do that after the 1974 test. So there is lots of evidence that, although not the biggest component, I think, in intelligence terms in the 21st century, human intelligence, even in South Asia, still has an important role to play. It can still do things that other types of intelligence can't do. So it's not an either or, it's a both. It's a complementary sort of element of a bigger intelligence sort of suite of activity by any secret intelligence service. I think the final question, I know I'm taking up too much time, was on diplomacy, and that was an excellent question, and I think a really important question in terms of the 21st century. Intelligence agencies are becoming much more involved in covert or clandestine diplomacy. We only have to think about the Middle East at the moment, and Bill Burns, the CIA director, shuttling backwards and forwards, almost Henry Kissinger-esque really, in shuttle diplomacy in the 1970s. Burns going backwards and forwards between capitals in the Middle East, trying to broker a solution between Israel and its various adversaries in the Middle East. I think intelligence, senior intelligence figures are being used more and more and more by politicians to conduct clandestine diplomacy as a way of sort of overcoming frictions or speaking to people that politicians don't think they're able to speak to. So I think it's a really interesting component of 21st century intelligence, and it's something that's really growing. And interestingly, again, not really much written about it academically in terms of how important it is clandestine diplomacy as an element of any intelligence service's contribution to its state security. I think it's really important, as recent events have shown, and it's growing in importance as well. So yeah, I think something we need to focus more attention on. So another great project for any of you guys to become involved in is clandestine diplomacy is really significant, I think.
That's wonderful. There are like so many ideas for research that have come out from here, and all these students who are doing MPhil and have a research thesis component. This was really a treasure trove of information, of evidence, and I'm sure it will push all of us to engage with your literature, not only on this book, but whatever you've written, and expand our knowledge base. So I just cannot thank you enough. I think I'm going to put this video on our YouTube channel so that more people can benefit from it, and it can, generate some interest in this discipline in Pakistan as well, when people will get to see as to, what is being done around the globe to foster more academic knowledge base. So thank you so much. I am really grateful. I understand that it has taken a lot of your time. It's pretty late in Pakistan as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Paul, I look forward to establishing contacts, linkages, having, the space open for our students as exchange visitors, and seek your support, both institutionally as well as personally, to undertake research as they go forward. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you, Rabia, and thank you so much for everyone. Such a warm welcome. It was a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you, and some fantastic questions as well. So I think it speaks very well about the future of intelligence studies in Pakistan. I think you've got some very smart people who are very smart students who are working on that sort of thing. So yeah, all best wishes. And if we can support you in any way, we'd be delighted to. And I'd love to speak to you, Rabia, as well about nuclear matters as well. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Be great. Let's keep in contact with everyone. Really enjoyed today, and really grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Over and out for now.
Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye.